They found a lipstick in her brain. The accident was caused by putting on makeup while driving. People who work with corpses, what is the most bizarre and creepy case you've had to deal with? Especially the last story is creepy as hell. My ex-in-laws were in the death business. They told me a story once about the county attorney whose wife passed away. The family was very wealthy and she had a mouth full of gold fillings. The attorney demanded that my in-laws retrieve the gold from her mouth. This required using a dental drill to drill down her teeth and dig out the gold. My ex-father-in-law complied with the attorney's wishes but was physically ill about having to do such a needless step to this lady. I come from a smallish town. We have one mortician and everyone knows him. His daughter dated my cousin during this period of time. One year, a different cousin got into a bad car accident right outside of the county and died on impact. Of course, they called it in and he was asked to come down to the scene and retrieve the body. He was told the estimated age of the girl, the make of her vehicle and which direction she was driving on the highway. The age and vehicle make matched that of his daughter who was visiting her boyfriend at the time. He couldn't get a hold of his daughter so he showed up at the scene fully prepared to be picking up his own child. Sadly enough, this scared him so badly that this was the last funeral he ever performed. 8 years later and he still visits my deceased cousin's parents regularly, just to check in. It's clearly stuck with him. Dad was a coroner before switching to doctor. I can never remember the details correctly for the medical stuff but pretty much the body getting examined was a former birthday clown. There weren't any external wounds so he figured the cause of death was internal. The guy had gastroparesis, which to my dad meant, cool, stomach contents should be in good shape. His team opens the dude up and sees this flurry of mess. There's partially digested birthday cake, that edible confetti stuff, streamers, and about a dozen pills of Xanax next to all of it. Dad sifts through the stomach some more and sees what looks like a sponge of some kind. He pulls one out and it's a sponge dino that comes in those capsules you drop in water. He finds more, about a small biome's worth. He thought he was getting pranked. The story pieces together as the clown decided to end it with the Xanax and booze. He gets a store-bought cake and eats it with everything on it, then chases down some dino sponges just for the hell of it. Heard on the news a friend from my youth had been killed. I was terribly sad for him. He never could escape his demons and it led him down some terrible paths. Came into work a few nights later and there he was face completely bashed in by a rock. This wasn't the first time someone I knew ended up in our morgue, but certainly the saddest. We popped him insides were outsides. Would not recommend. On my first night shift I thought staff were messing with me because I kept hearing what sounded like breathing. A fresh body was brought in and was releasing gas. I'd never dealt with anyone dying in the hour being brought in, so it was scary hearing this body breathing. I've been there when family members have passed and witnessed breathing and limbs moving. I know it's normal, but as a student, the staff likes to mess with you. A bizarre one was piecing a guy back together after he committed suicide with a gunshot to his face. Family wanted an open casket. Had to try our best, then ask one family member in, to see if they still wanted open casket because we just didn't feel like it was right. Dad came in, sees that no matter how we tried we couldn't make him look the same as before and agrees that the family shouldn't see him this way. The day we delivered him to the funeral parlor, the family changes their mind and has an open casket anyway. I found out the rest of the family didn't know he shot himself in the face. We ended up getting a letter of complaint from other members of the family for the open casket. I finished as a student a few days after, but would still love to be in that career though. Licensed embalmer here. I've worked for large funeral homes and did coroner removals for a decently large city and currently work as a trade embalmer. I've had lots of suicides. I embalmed a 4-year-old that a cop blew a stop sign and T-boned their minivan. That one really hurt. But the one that was weird was this. 18-year-old girl hung herself. So I do the embalming like normal, even though it sucked having to do that. Now the weird part, I get a text from my friends a few hours later saying that another one of our friends' fiance's sisters killed herself, and if I knew anything about it, which really sucks because my friend's wedding is in 4 days. Turns out that 18-year-old was the sister to the bride. So I have to go to the wedding 4 days later while everyone is still grieving the loss and keep my mouth shut, and I'm the one that embalmed her. This was in a town of about 250,000 people. I work with the dead, procure eyes and corneas for transplant. While I was working on one guy at the medical examiner's office, they brought in another guy whose cats had eaten his face clean. Just his face, nothing else. It was a sort of decaying, but still somewhat normal looking, dude, with a bright, Halloween-looking skull picked clean. Lots of murder victims, gunshots, car accidents, even one train accident. A guy who hanged himself in front of his kids with a dog leash, which was still in the bag with his body. High-caliber self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face, with teeth and jaw and bits everywhere and a bunch of gauze stuffed into the remaining hole. Let's not forget the guy in the decomposing room who was just a pile of bones, hair, and leathery tissue paired with a bucket of goo. Not a mortician, but in middle school my friend's dad was. This wasn't a situation about a body, just the mortician himself. He was a single dad and my friend's sister was going to a school dance but hadn't put on much makeup before and she didn't want to be late. So the mortician dad volunteered to do it for her because, I put on people's makeup every day. When he finished she looked in the mirror and freaked out. I look like I'm dead. He just nonchalantly said, "What did you expect? I've only ever worked with dead people before," and just walked away. I wish there was a picture of it. She looked like a deranged undead clown. My brother told me a story of when one of his friends was a mortician's assistant. One time he had to work on a guy who had shot himself in the head with a shotgun. He said the guy kinda looked like Sid from Ice Age. That wasn't the worst, however. The worst part is how he felt about the whole situation. He apparently felt disconnected, not registering that this body was once a living man and not just something to clean up. My brother said he quit that night. Not a mortician. This comes from my mother back when she was a teenager. A guy she knows takes a job with a local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift. All was well for the first few months. Dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up, guy is freaking out, says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving the guy there alone with the dead lady. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it is just his mind playing tricks on him, goes about his business. He hears it again, little louder than last time. It is late, he is alone, he is just hearing things, probably just the pipes settling, the plumbing is old after all. Short time passes and it is louder. At this point he is sure he isn't just imagining things, he knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was messing with him. He has been shaken all evening and this a-hole is pranking him. He marches over, "Very funny you a-hole," yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. Dead lady grabs the guy's wrist. He lets out this scream and bolts for the door. Forgets his car, runs all the way home. Turns out, old lady wasn't dead, hospital got it wrong, hooray 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something and they had been sure she had passed on earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day, said he would never set foot there ever again. A writing professor of mine used to work in small-town journalism and decided to interview some folks from the local retirement home to get a close-up view of his town's history. One of his interviews was an ancient, retired mortician who told him a rather interesting story. Shortly before 1920, two teens were going to a school dance in a blizzard. The carriage they had taken got stranded and the boy went for help. The girl unfortunately froze to death in the carriage, in an upright, seated position. Apparently the mortician had to sit her in a rocking chair in front of the fire to thaw her out before he could go about his usual business. Mom was a mortician. Of the stories she's told me, creepiest would either be the guy that had his face eaten off by wild boars while hunting or the guy that fell into a wood chipper. The funny thing was, I was at a breakfast a few days later where fellow high schoolers were trying to gross out the girls at the table, and when they pointed out that I wasn't really bothered by it, I kept chewing and said, "Yeah, my mom got that guy." Said it was gross. Everyone goes silent. I stopped chewing and looked up to everyone looking pale. Shrugged, "Oh, y'all forgot she's a mortician didn't you?" and kept eating. Uncomfortable for her was one that was also kind of sad. This woman was morbidly obese. Like, when they somehow all got her on the gurney at her home, when they were pushing it out, the wheels were pushing indentions down into the wood floors. Now this woman is what some bullies would call a whale. I wouldn't, but we all know a-holes. Well, apparently this woman loved the hell out of some blue whales. Family kept going on and on about it. So the time comes for them to bring the clothes for her wake. They bring a big blue moo-moo and a gaudy blue whale brooch. Then they hand her the CD to play. Usually it's church hymns or sad country songs etc. No one listens to it before, because why would you? So the service starts, mom pops the CD in, boop dang blue whale calls fill the funeral home. My mom was very professional with her job, but every funeral director had to excuse themselves to compose themselves. My best friend works in the death business. So, since she doesn't have a Reddit account, I'm going to steal her karma because this is my favorite story. She tells me all sorts of lovely things about her job and the recoveries she has done, but my favorite involves a gurney and some stairs. To set the scene, a family called in that their mother had passed in her apartment. 3rd floor, narrow halls and no elevators. Anyways, she goes to pick up the body to take back to the funeral home with an assistant. So they get up there and lift this woman who is close to 300 pounds onto the gurney and begin their journey down to the van. Mind you, the whole family was there and pretty much in hysterics and crowd around as they make their way to the stairs. With the family watching, they make it about halfway down the first flight of stairs when the body starts to slide. There's no way to reposition, so my friend who is at the foot of the gurney is now about butt level to the freshly deceased. So, trying to make the best of the situation, they continue their way down and try not to shift the body anymore. The thing about dead bodies is that gas starts to exit pretty quickly, and I'm sure you know where my story is going. The body started letting out farts straight into my friend's face. Shh, 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 with every step down they take, and this poor girl has to keep a straight face while getting crop dusted by a dead lady with her whole family watching. Story from a friend of a friend: she, the mortician, met some guy at the bar. They hit it off and she gave him her number. Within a couple of days she finds out that the guy died in a car accident because his body ended up at her place of work. Before the funeral service she received several calls from an unknown number, and whenever she picked up there was no response. Eventually, she got the eerie hunch that it may be him and proceeded to address him by name. Tells him to pass in peace and to stop calling. It worked. Uncomfortable? Being trapped in the morgue alone during a hurricane. Our morgue was basically in a basement type situation and the hospital was near a main waterway that flooded. I had to move all the bodies to the highest cabinets, pray that generators would keep everyone cold, and was standing on my desk for about 2 hours when someone finally came for me. Bizarre would be a drowned guy who was DOA, and once locked up in the cabinet a tapping noise started coming from him. It was a crab that had made itself at home inside him, and when it got cold he wanted out. Creepy was when we got some people who were doing bath salts and had eaten other people. They looked crazy even in death. Not a mortician, nor is this a mortician-specific story. I figure you just want creepy dead body stuff. Was an EMT that got access to a bunch of places and experiences because I am me. Hanging out in the morgue picking the brain of the guy on graveyard shift. Had a corpse sit up on one of the gurney while mid-conversation. I go pale. He just looks at me and says they do that sometimes. A particularly difficult family. None of them could agree at all on what to do with their dad. One faction wanted burial, the other was demanding cremation. After much shouting they finally agreed on a compromise. They wanted us to cut their father's body in half. That way one half could be cremated and the other half buried. I had to explain to the unfortunate arranger, who at this point looked beyond exhausted, that no, we could not saw a human body in half because that would be very illegal and very messy. I work in the industry. The creepiest thing I have seen would be one of my first pickups. There was a humidifier in the room, but I didn't know about it. I thought the deceased was still alive and wheezing. The most uncomfortable would probably be a guy in a halfway house style place and there were people everywhere. Just strange situation. Or a lady that was a crazy hoarder. Or the time someone died at a huge party in the front yard. You ain't experienced life until you see a 2-week-old decomposed body that's been in the heat. I didn't know maggots could be so big. Have a colleague that had a person who had passed away 6 weeks earlier. Said it was mostly liquefied. I have to say it has been the most humbling experience personally. There are some bad eggs, but overall most people are amazing and you really appreciate those people that have lived such good lives. Don't leave your family for granted. I see it all too often when someone dies, family tear each other up over money and petty feuds. Give your loved ones love and respect. A lady I work with used to pick up the bodies for the coroner. One time they had to collect a woman that was laying in a very hot attic apartment for a couple months. All her liquids ran out onto the floor and dried, and when they tried to pick her up she started coming apart like an overly tender turkey. Her coworker sent her to the van to get more bags, and when she got back he had finished bagging the lady. Classy. Changed how I think about turkey. There aren't a lot of creepy or bizarre cases that stick out in my mind, but uncomfortable things definitely come up. Whenever there's a young person on the table, it is sad. The degree of decomposing can lead to a lot of difficult nights. The smell alone can really get to you. The thing that always spooks me, though, is when I'm raising an axillary artery. The site that we look for it is the area directly distal, towards fingers, away from body mass, to the armpit. There are a lot of tendons and such in there, as well. When you're holding the person's arm up, digging around near the tendons, sometimes their arm will move. It happens a lot, but I still get momentarily terrified when the person grabs me. We picked up a suicide on a major holiday, Thanksgiving or Christmas, I can't remember. Took her back to the funeral home. Undressed her and had to wait for medical examiner. Family decides to cremate. We had dressed her for a viewing, everything was normal. Later that day she was ready to be cremated. I put her in, started the machine and went back inside. I had to embalm someone else. About an hour and I heard like 5 loud pops. First thought was a pacemaker, brain stimulator, something I had missed. I let it finish, swept it into the tray. And a small handgun came out. Now I had seen all of her. Seriously, where did she have that at? The only spot is inside her private parts. The question is why? It's been 10+ years and I still don't know. Not a mortician story, but my dad was in the Coast Guard in the early 70s, stationed in San Francisco. Between the Golden Gate Bridge and Bay Bridge, they would get a lot of jumpers, and the coasties had to retrieve the bodies. At night or in bad weather, they would sometimes take hours or even a day or more to find. One day they retrieved a body that was being eaten by crabs. Dad said there were more than a dozen crabs all over the body. The body was basically a big piece of crab bait. Some other coastie on the boat is pulling the crabs off the body, putting them in a cooler. Guy says to my dad, "My wife loves Dungeness crab," and apparently was notorious for being the guy who claimed the crabs. So many. But you get used to it. Fat people purge when they die, and usually end up with vomit all over their face from the weight on their gut. I end up feeling resentful of some very overweight people because I know I will have to pick them up when they die, and there's a chance it'll throw out my back. Summertime equals maggots. Babies just look like they're sleeping. Very peaceful. A co-worker unknowingly picked up his own estranged son who had overdosed in a car. Picked up a 4-year-old boy in Batman pajamas. Won't ever forget that. That one was the worst. Also, since I have you, I've noticed an uptick in young teen suicides in the last year. If you have someone in your life who is a young teenager, or anyone really, check in with them. Let them know they're loved. I'm tired of picking up dead bullied girls. The worst by far is the human soup guy. Apparently this elderly gentleman passed away while having a bath. With the water still running, he was living alone in the house with very little family. I don't remember how long he was in the bath before someone found him. My dad goes to pick up the body and it's human soup. The hot water constantly running and the amount of time caused his body to turn to mush. He said the smell was the worst he ever smelt. He got back to the office later that day and his boss told him to throw away his suit and he'd buy him another. I worked as an autopsy lab assistant at a local medical examiner's office. The ones that really annoyed or bothered me after a while. Annoyance is a part of the detachment and making it just a part of the job, on my end. I'm seeing up to 100 fresh corpses a week. The one that sticks out is a woman that was 510 pounds, and was hit by a car and ejected at high speeds and then hit by an 18-wheeler. Now imagine 500 pounds of hamburger helper with large bits of organ and bone mixed in with a few chunks of leg, and that was a fun bag to try to prep an x-ray for autopsy. Having to pull parts of a dude out of a bucket and piece him together like some macabre jigsaw puzzle was a very interesting second day as well. A suicide via crossbow was pretty cool, as you really don't see that every day. The most interesting, that I can share, was a murder via katana. We were all super interested to see what that looked like, and it turns out it was one perfect stroke between the ribs into the heart. No bones were hit, just the heart. We joked about a master ninja hunting the city for weeks after. The worst is always decomposing bodies and water finds. It is the worst smell of the bunch by far, and the spongy, soupy texture bodies get from long times in an aquatic environment is the absolute worst. They tend to burst everywhere when you cut them open too. It was a sad job most of the time, as we only got those that suffered a violent death that needed investigation. Lots of children and people that were clearly failed by society. Transported a 60-year-old woman to the morgue after a severe car accident. She had ran into a large tree head-on 75 miles per hour. Face was mashed in completely. After they x-rayed the body, they found a tube of lipstick in her brain. Cause of death was putting on makeup while driving. I had never been in the room with death until my infant daughter passed away last weekend. Congenital brain issue, expected death at home. She died quite suddenly, and I'd always heard that bodies can move and breathe after death. I was holding her, she had stopped breathing, and she had no heartbeat. We had a stethoscope handy because she was on a feeding tube and we had to check placement. Suddenly she started gasping. She started doing agonal breathing, a completely last-ditch brainstem reflex to revive herself. I thought it was just gas at first. Then she kept doing it. After about 5 minutes of being dead and blue and without breathing or heartbeat, she brought herself back completely. Pinked right up, normal heart rate. It was the most incredible and shocking and awful thing I've ever seen in my life. I wish someone had warned me this was possible. When the hospice nurse got there, she said that dying infants often practice death and die several times. Our daughter incurred some brain damage from this, not that it was an issue in our case. She ended up dying and reviving herself with agonal breathing one more time before she finally passed. The process took 8 hours. Now that I have seen someone die and come back, I fully understand why people created zombie mythology and otherwise invented paranormal explanations for these things. I saw this with my own eyes and still don't believe it. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Well done for making it through the entire video. You should be a mortician. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more creepy videos. Click the right box for the Mortician playlist. Let us know in the comments if you have ever seen a death body.